With his major battles behind him, David HaMellech was now able to focus his attention upon the spiritual needs of the nation. And in Shmuel Bet Perek 7, in one of his discussions with Natan HaNavi, his spiritual advisor, we have David HaMellech commenting, Anochi Yoshev Beveit Arazim, Ve'aron HaElokim Yoshev Betoch HaYiriyah. While I reside in a house made of cedar wood, the Holy Ark, the Aron HaElokim, dwells amongst flimsy curtains, implying that the house of God deserves something far more befitting than its present structure. Shortly thereafter, Natan HaNavi has a vision dream in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu informs him that L'miyom ha'eloti et b'nei Yisrael miMitzrayim v'yad hayom hazeh, from the very beginnings of my relationship with the Bnei Yisrael, when I took them out of Egypt up until the present day, Lo yashavti bebayit ve'eheye mithalech be'ohel u'b'mishkan. I did not dwell in a house, but rather traveled around in an ohel and a mishkan, which at face value is a rather strange statement from the standpoint of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When David HaMellech makes his observation, he is evaluating the situation from the standpoint of human eyes. Body language of the comparison between where he lived and where the Shekhinah rested pointed to the fact that a higher priority was placed upon the needs of the king when compared to the building that housed the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And hence, David's observation was appropriate. HaKadosh Baruch Hu complaining of the fact that he had been relegated to an ohel or a mishkan rather than a bayit is somewhat puzzling. To a human being this would make a difference. To God, as understood from within the tradition, where the Shekhinah rests should be of no consequence. And for this reason we need to turn to some form of symbolism that underpin the terms bayit and ohel in this context. Symbolically, a bayit reflects permanence, whereas the ohel, by its very nature, reflects a state that is merely temporary, and while it has the advantage of adapting itself to different locations, it nevertheless is a structure that is not to be taken for granted. And possibly it was this aspect to which Yaakov referred when, upon awakening from his dream vision, commented that this was a Beit Elokim, and furthermore, this was the Shar HaShamayim. The permanence of this location was that it had a direct link to the world of spirituality. And therefore, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in his communication with Natan HaNavi, identifies the present physical link between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the world as an ohel and a mishkan, rather than a bayit, he is not necessarily describing the quality of the structure, but rather the lack of a permanent bond between the spiritual world. The relationship between the ruchni, the spiritual, and the gashmi was at best an ohel ubemishkan, a temporary arrangement. There is a debate amongst the mefarshim as to the need of a double expression, ohel and mishkan. The context of the text would suggest that both terms refer to the situation at the time, namely the sanctuary at Shiloh, for the 300 or so years before the building of the Bet HaMikdash. Others suggest, though, that while the Mishkan refers to Shiloh, the Ohel component refers to the Mishkan during the 38 or so years prior to the crossing of the Jordan until the erection of a more permanent structure in Shiloh. With this reworking of the two terms, Ohel and Bayit, we can also justify the link between Beit HaMikdash number 1 and Beit HaMikdash number 2 on account of the fact that both structures were built on a physical location that was a direct link to a parallel counterpart in the spiritual worlds, as opposed to the Mishkan, that of the desert, and also that of Shiloh, deemed to be an ohel, symbolizing the fact that neither of the structures paralleled the spiritual counterpart. And therefore, while one could argue that there is a greater connection between the Mishkan and the Bet HaMikdash from the standpoint of the intensity of the Kedusha, which, as we pointed out earlier, was less in the Bet HaMikdash number 2, nevertheless, from the standpoint of its core function, namely a link between the Gashmi, physical, and Ruchni, Beit HaMikdash number 1, at its very core, would need to be linked to Beit HaMikdash number 2, rather than it being linked on account of the intensity of the Shekhinah to the Mishkan of the Midbar, or the Mishkan at Shiloh.